Hello and welcome to another gentle descent into history. Tonight, we won't revisit the past as it was, but drift slowly through the quiet corridors of what might have been. A world shaped not by firestorms and fury, but by the absence of war. A world where World War II never happened. Perhaps you're nestled beneath the sheets, letting the hum of the day fade softly into silence. Or maybe you're just beginning to unwind, eyes heavy, thoughts loose. However you've arrived here, I'm grateful to share this moment with you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Are we oceans apart or separated by only a few miles, both looking up at the same evening sky? If soft-spoken stories and quiet reflections are your kind of company, be sure to subscribe. There are so many paths left to wander. Now, take a breath. Let the noise of the day drift away, and close your eyes. Imagine a world where the most defining war in modern history simply never came to be. The beginning of a different century. To imagine a world without World War II is to imagine a world that never learned its most painful lessons, at least not in the way it did in our timeline.
No Auschwitz.
No Nagasaki. No total mobilization of the planet's industry, spirit, and sorrow. But also, perhaps, no United Nations, no widespread decolonization, and no rapid technological leap driven by war. It is a strange thing to imagine, peace not as a result of hard-won battles, but as a lingering thread unbroken by fire. And so, our journey begins at the end of the First World War. The year is 1919. The world is exhausted. Europe lies in a quiet, uncertain stillness, shell-shocked from years of trench warfare. Empires have crumbled. New nations are rising. And at Versailles, a treaty is being written, not just in ink, but in bitterness. The Versailles that never was. In our reality, the Treaty of Versailles was a punitive document. It levied crushing reparations on Germany, dismantled its military, and demanded an admission of guilt that burned deeply into the German psyche. It was, in effect, a blueprint for resentment. Now imagine that this treaty, instead of vengeance, had been guided by foresight. Imagine a treaty that understood that peace must be built, not imposed. In this alternate world, the leaders of France, Britain, and the United States, Georges Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and Woodrow Wilson, choose moderation over revenge. They recognize the fragility of Germany's new democracy. They remember how easily bitterness can be weaponized. Reparations are set, but they are humane, enough to acknowledge loss, but not enough to break the nation's spirit. Territorial losses are negotiated, not enforced. And the war guilt clause, the infamous Article 231, is removed entirely. The Weimar Republic, battered but breathing, begins to recover. Inflation still comes, as do the cultural shocks and political tensions of the 1920s. But without the crippling burden of Versailles, German democracy finds its footing. Extremist parties still exist, but they remain on the fringes. Adolf Hitler remains a failed painter, perhaps arrested once or twice for stirring up trouble, but never more than a footnote in the margins of politics. The world, quietly, exhales. A different Germany emerges. By the mid-1930s, Germany is still rebuilding. There is no Nazi regime, no rearmament program, no swastikas hung from every building. Instead, the country slowly reforms itself into a stable, if imperfect, parliamentary democracy. The economy grows, gradually, bolstered by trade with its neighbors. German culture thrives once again, its philosophers, writers, scientists, and artists flourishing in an atmosphere of cautious optimism rather than dread. The scars of the First World War remain, of course. No timeline erases that pain. But the rage and desperation that would have fueled a second war never congeal into fascism. Without a Hitler, there is no Third Reich. Without a Third Reich, there is no plan for conquest. And without that plan, the storm that once broke over the world never gathers. Europe without war. Europe in the 1940s is a place of contradictions. Without the catalyzing horror of World War II, change comes more slowly. The old colonial empires, Britain, France, Belgium, remain intact for longer. They are not bankrupted by war, not morally shaken by the atrocities of fascism. India does not gain its independence in 1947. Algeria does not rise in rebellion in the 1950s. The push for decolonization is delayed, perhaps by decades. But Europe itself remains largely peaceful. The lines of the map are redrawn not by tanks, but by treaties and trade. The Soviet Union, ever watchful, remains a powerful presence in the East. Stalin still rules with an iron fist, but without the war, his paranoia is directed more inward. There is no great patriotic war to galvanize the people. No need to seize Eastern Europe under the guise of liberating it from fascism. The Iron Curtain may still fall eventually, but much later, and perhaps in a different shape. The United States remains distant. Without the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, America does not enter a global war. Its economy recovers from the Great Depression more slowly. There is no massive military-industrial complex, no wartime boom, no GI Bill. The US becomes an economic power, but not the dominant global force it would become after 1945. The 20th century, in this timeline, may not be the American century. It may be something else entirely. Technology without war. One of the strangest consequences of a world without World War II is the technological landscape it leaves behind. In our world, the war accelerated innovation at an unprecedented pace. Jet engines, radar, rocketry, nuclear energy, computers, all saw massive development thanks to wartime needs. The Manhattan Project alone brought together some of the greatest minds of the century, driven by urgency, fear, and ambition. In this alternate world, progress is slower. Jet propulsion may still emerge, but in the 1960s, not the 1940s. Space travel becomes a dream deferred. There is no race to build the atomic bomb. There is no Hiroshima, no Nagasaki. Nuclear energy remains theoretical until the 1950s or beyond. Computers evolve more slowly, too. Alan Turing still theorized the machine, but without the pressure of breaking the Enigma code, practical development lags. The first true computers are massive, rare, and limited, tools for scientists, not the seeds of a digital revolution. The Internet? That's a question for a much later part of our journey. The world holds its breath. And so the 1940s pass. Quietly, uneasily, but without global war. In some ways, this world is more peaceful. Tens of millions of lives are never lost. Cities remain intact. Families stay together. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, and millions of others, never occurs. The pain, the trauma, the unbearable grief, it never takes root. But in other ways, this world is less certain. Without the shared horror of World War II, the post-war consensus, the belief in human rights, in global cooperation, in the necessity of peace, is slower to form. There is no Nuremberg, no United Nations, no Marshall Plan. It is a world of shadows, both fewer and more subtle. A world where some of the worst tragedies never happen, but where some of the best responses never come either. And it is only just beginning. The global ripple, a world unmoved by war. Now that the storm of World War II never came, we begin to see the ripples unfold, not only in Europe and America, but across the entire globe. As you relax deeper into the softness of your sheets, let's continue drifting outward, as though from a stone dropped into a still pond, watching how the absence of war reshapes the waves of history in every direction. The 1940s become a quieter decade. And yet, that quiet masks the shifting foundations beneath the surface. Without the rush to rebuild bombed-out cities or care for millions of wounded soldiers, the world's energy turns elsewhere. Sometimes slowly, sometimes unevenly, but always differently. The United States, still a sleeping giant. In our world, the attack on Pearl Harbor dragged the United States out of isolation and into the center of global affairs. Factories were retooled for war. Entire industries were born. And in the aftermath, the US emerged not just victorious, but transformed. In this alternate history, however, that transformation never comes. There is no surprise attack in Hawaii. No Roosevelt declaring a date which will live in infamy. The United States continues to recover from the Great Depression. Cautiously. Progress is real but slow. Without the massive demand for military goods, industries grow more modestly. The economy improves, but unemployment remains higher. There's no wartime boom. No Rosie the Riveter.
No massive mobilisation.
Instead, the 1940s in America feel like an extended version of the New Deal era, a slow march towards stability. Public works programs continue. Infrastructure expands. Social security becomes a permanent fixture of American life. But the national mood is inward, not expansive. There's less patriotism and more cautious optimism. The United States is still powerful, but it doesn't see itself as the world's policeman. Not yet. The South remains the South. Without the war, another major shift doesn't happen, one that might seem minor at first glance, but ripples across generations. In our reality, the war effort demanded that African Americans participate fully in American life. In factories, in the military, in leadership roles. That exposure to broader opportunity fueled the early fires of the civil rights movement. Returning black veterans demanded equality after serving their country. A generation came home unwilling to go back to second-class citizenship. But in a world without the war, those sparks arrive later. There is no Tuskegee Airmen, no Double V campaign, no post-war GI Bill opening doors to black soldiers. The movement for civil rights still comes, but it's slower, quieter, more local. It builds gradually rather than erupting in the 1950s and 60s. The South remains largely segregated for longer, and the national conversation about race is delayed by decades. A painful truth about a peaceful world: not all progress survives the silence. Japan without expansion. Now drift across the Pacific. Picture Japan in the 1930s, industrializing rapidly, crowded with ambition, and increasingly eager to expand. In our reality, Japan invaded China, struck at Pearl Harbor, and plunged into brutal conflict across Asia and the Pacific. But without the broader ignition of global war, Japan makes different choices. Perhaps it still invades Manchuria. Perhaps it still desires empire. But it faces resistance not from a unified world at war, but from neighboring nations and regional diplomacy. A global conflict never materializes. And eventually, Japan's expansion slows, not because of bombs, but because of limits. Resources stretch thin. Local rebellions flare up. And without the US response to Pearl Harbor, Japan never finds itself in total war with a global superpower. Its economy grows steadily. Its military posture remains strong, but not dominant. Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain cities, not symbols of devastation. And the emperor, untouched by surrender, remains a revered symbol, perhaps for many more years. China without occupation. China, too, feels the change. In our world, it suffered terribly. Millions dead, cities destroyed, and deep scars left by both the Japanese invasion and the later civil war between the nationalists and communists. But without total war, some of those scars fade. The civil war between Mao Zedong's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists still takes place, but under different pressures. There is no Japanese invasion to momentarily unite them. And without the distraction of World War II, the rest of the world watches more closely. Perhaps the communists still win. Perhaps they don't. But their victory, if it comes, is less sudden. The People's Republic of China may still rise, but it takes longer and emerges under less dramatic circumstances. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, these still unfold, perhaps later, perhaps differently, or perhaps not at all. A world without World War II is not a world without suffering. It is simply a world where suffering flows in different rivers. The Middle East empire stretches on. Now float westward again, into the deserts and oil fields of the Middle East. In our timeline, the aftermath of World War II saw the collapse of European colonial control across the region. Britain withdrew. France was forced out. New nations, Israel, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, emerged from the ruins. But here, with no global war to exhaust the empires, colonial control lasts longer. The British remain in Palestine, Egypt, and Iraq. The French hold Syria and Lebanon. There is unrest. There are uprisings. But independence comes later, and with even more conflict. Without the Holocaust, the pressure to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine is less immediate. Zionism still exists. Jewish refugees still seek a homeland. But the scale and urgency are reduced. The State of Israel may still be declared, but later, under very different terms. Or it may emerge elsewhere. Uganda, perhaps. Or Argentina. Dreams shift in the absence of fire. Africa and the empire that never ends. Farther south, the vast continent of Africa remains under the colonial thumb longer than in our timeline. World War II did much to accelerate decolonization, weakening European powers and empowering local resistance movements. In this version of history, however, the empires hold on. British Kenya, Belgian Congo, French West Africa. These regions remain colonial for decades longer. Independence movements form, but they lack the global momentum created by the war. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Patrice Lumumba, they still rise, but face even steeper hills. And so the 1950s in Africa look more like the 1930s. Unrest beneath the surface, but power held in faraway capitals. Progress, once again, delayed. The Soviet Union watches. Back in Europe, one massive presence looms over all, the Soviet Union. In our timeline, Stalin's USSR bore the brunt of Nazi invasion, more than 20 million dead. But that suffering came with a strange benefit. After defeating Hitler, the Soviets occupied Eastern Europe. They didn't just survive, they expanded. In this alternate world, they have no such excuse. There is no fascist enemy to crush, no war hero status, no liberated countries to hold temporarily. As a result, the USSR remains powerful, but boxed in. Stalin still purges. The gulags still operate. But Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, remains independent. There is no Warsaw Pact, no Berlin Wall, no arms race. Or at least, not yet. The Cold War that never burns. Which leads us to a final question for tonight. Without World War II, is there still a Cold War? The answer is murky. Without the nuclear arms race sparked by the Manhattan Project, there are no ICBMs in the 1950s.
Non mutually assured destruction.
No duck and cover drills in American schools. But the ideological tension between capitalism and communism still exists. The United States and the Soviet Union remain wary of one another. Proxy conflicts still occur, perhaps in Latin America, perhaps in Asia, but they are slower to form, less immediate. The term Cold War may still be used, but not as a global paradigm, more as a regional chess match, moving cautiously across a quieter board. And so the 1950s dawn. Not with rebuilding, but with rearranging. A world untouched by total war finds itself untouched, too, by total reinvention. There are no victory parades, no Marshall Plan, no World Bank or IMF in their current form. There is no NATO, no global consensus on rights, sovereignty, or peacekeeping. The horrors of the Holocaust remain unspoken because they never happened. But the warning signs, xenophobia, nationalism, authoritarianism, they still simmer beneath the surface. History, even in peace, is never still. And now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to float, we'll leave this altered world here, for now. Let the imagined silence of a warless century settle gently over you. We'll pick up again in the next part, exploring what the 1960s, 70s, and 80s might look like in this altered timeline. Until then, rest well. The 1960s and 70s, a world adrift without fire. Welcome back, dreamer. As the night deepens, we return to our thought experiment, a world shaped not by war, but by the quiet unfolding of time. A world in which the Second World War never came.
No concentration camps.
No atomic age. No vast military alliances crisscrossing the globe. We now step into the 1960s and 70s, a period in our reality filled with civil rights movements, moon landings, proxy wars, and revolution. But here, in our quiet alternate path, history bends in subtler, slower arcs. Let's ease into this era. Breathe in. Let your muscles relax. Let the distant echo of this imagined past unfold softly around you. The United States. Change without catalyst. In our reality, the 1960s in America were a time of upheaval. The civil rights movement surged forward, fueled by the legacy of black veterans returning from World War II and by the bold voices of new generations. The Vietnam War escalated, sparking protests and generational divides. John F. Kennedy led with vision. Lyndon B. Johnson passed sweeping legislation. Martin Luther King Jr. marched. Malcolm X challenged. Cities erupted. And the world changed. But what happens in a United States where the Second World War never took place? Without the civil rights momentum of the post-war years, the movement still comes, but slower. Rosa Parks still refuses to move. The Montgomery bus boycott still happens. But the legal wins take longer. Brown versus Board of Education may not come in 1954. Perhaps it comes in 1964 or 1970. The southern states resist as always, but the federal government, lacking the moral urgency created by World War II, moves cautiously. Dr. King still rises. His voice still echoes. But without the galvanizing structure of Cold War image-making, where the US sought to show moral superiority over the Soviets, there's less external pressure to change quickly. Civil rights progress still occurs, but at a different pace, with a different tone, and perhaps with more pain. Meanwhile, the political landscape evolves more gently. There is no JFK riding the wave of post-war optimism. Perhaps he still wins in 1960, but as a senator known for policy, not wartime heroism. His assassination, if it still happens, carries a different kind of weight, less myth, more mourning. Without the Vietnam War, an extension of Cold War domino theory, there are no student protests on the same scale. No Kent State.
No Woodstock.
No draft cards burned in public squares. The youth of America still rebel, of course. Rock and roll still roars. The counterculture still grows. But it is less unified, less defined by a singular, world-shaping event. The 60s feel more like the 50s. The fire is there, but without the war, it burns more slowly. Space without the race. And above it all, the stars. In our timeline, the space race was fueled by fear. The Soviets launched Sputnik. America responded with NASA. In a little over a decade, humans walked on the moon, not because it was easy, but because it was urgent. But in our alternate history, that urgency is missing. There is no Cold War rivalry to push humanity skyward. Sputnik still happens, but maybe in the 1970s, not the 1950s. The moon landing, if it comes, might not happen until the 1980s, or later. And it won't be broadcast to a planet holding its breath. It'll be quieter, less triumphant, more scientific. NASA may still exist. So may its Soviet counterpart. But both agencies are smaller, more academic. Their missions focused on satellites, communications, and weather tracking, not flag planting and geopolitics. In this version of history, space is not a battlefield for pride. It is a curiosity, a frontier not yet crossed. And that changes more than we realize. The technology that waits. Without the moon landing, the cascade of technological innovation also slows. Think of the things we gained indirectly from that race. Microprocessors, advanced materials, satellite communications, global positioning systems. In our reality, the urgency of the Cold War brought these technologies into our lives faster. But here, there is no rush. Computers remain larger for longer. The internet, still born in university labs, remains a curiosity for academics well into the 1990s. Personal computing, if it comes at all, comes slower. There is no Apple in a garage. No Bill Gates in the 70s. No dot-com boom in the 90s. The digital revolution still happens. But it's foggy, deferred, as though the world forgot the clock was ticking. Europe without unity. Across the Atlantic, Europe watches the decades unfold. In our world, the shared trauma of war led to an unusual outcome, unity. The European Union began as a coal and steel agreement, but its real foundation was the promise of peace. Never again, they said. Never again would France and Germany go to war. Trade would replace tanks. Dialogue would replace division. But in our alternate world, that pain never came. And so the pressure to unite simply doesn't exist. Germany and France remain wary neighbors. Cooperation is limited. There is no common currency. No Schengen area. No Brussels bureaucracy slowly weaving the continent together. Europe remains a patchwork of sovereign states, each moving in its own rhythm. War hasn't destroyed them, but neither has it forced them to collaborate. The continent is peaceful, but fragmented. The Middle East, a pressure cooker without vent. Meanwhile, the Middle East simmers. Without the immediate post-war collapse of British and French mandates, independence movements remain disorganized. The State of Israel is never declared in 1948. The Holocaust, having never happened, leaves no moral imperative behind. Still, Jewish migration continues. Still, tensions rise. But without a specific founding moment, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians takes a different shape. Perhaps smaller, perhaps longer, or perhaps it doesn't happen at all, not in the way we know it. Instead, the Middle East becomes a theater of imperial bureaucracy and local resistance. Oil is discovered. Wealth flows. But so do grievances. Revolutions stir in Iran, Iraq, and Egypt, but each on its own schedule. Without Cold War alliances, regimes fall or rise not based on ideology, but on internal strife. The US and USSR, distracted by their own slower growth, intervene less, and so power accumulates differently. A quieter world is not a calmer one. Africa, freedom deferred. In Africa, the 1960s in our timeline brought a wave of independence. Country after country cast off colonial rule.
Kenya,
Nigeria, Kenya, Congo, Zambia, the list goes on. But that was accelerated by the exhaustion of war. European powers, bankrupt and broken, could no longer justify the cost of empire. In our version of history, those powers are stronger, and so they hold on longer. The Congo remains under Belgian control. Kenya remains British. Algeria remains French. Protests grow. Movements form. But the timeline stretches. Kwame Nkrumah's dream of Pan-Africanism flickers in a dimmer light. South Africa, too, evolves more slowly. The anti-apartheid movement still grows, but without the global moral clarity provided by anti-fascist sentiment, it gains traction more gradually. Mandela may still rise, but in a different time, in a different world. The global economy, richer, but narrower. By the late 1970s, the world is richer and smaller. Without war, industries were never destroyed. Cities were never rebuilt. Populations were never scattered. And so economic growth is steady, but conservative. There is no Marshall Plan to flood Europe with aid. No Bretton Woods institutions redefining currency. Globalization exists, but on a slower track. Trade routes open, but they are not highways. They are winding paths. Asia, in particular, evolves differently. Japan is a strong power, but not a miracle economy. China remains a sleeping giant, unawakened by revolution. India's independence is delayed, and Southeast Asia, untouched by US bombs or Soviet advisors, follows a quieter path. There are fewer boom years, fewer crashes, fewer miracles, but also fewer collapses. A world without fire is a world without ashes, but it is also a world without sparks. Where we are now, and so we arrive at the end of the 1970s. In our world, this was a time of tension, of Cold War games, of gas lines and embassies seized, of disco and decline and things falling apart. In this alternate world, it is neither better nor worse. Just different. There are fewer ruins, but also fewer monuments. Fewer villains, but also fewer heroes. It is a world defined not by catastrophe, but by inertia. Not by chaos, but by quiet. And in that quiet, there is still struggle, still beauty, still ambition. But everything unfolds with less urgency, as if the planet is walking, not running. As you drift further into rest, remember, history is not only shaped by events, but by their absence. The fires we fear sometimes build the bridges we walk on later. Sleep well. As the world sails through the 1960s and into the 70s, a strange paradox sets in. Without the trauma of World War II, the planet avoids a certain kind of suffering, but it also misses out on a kind of clarity. The war, in our reality, revealed the extremes of human behavior, the cruelty and the courage, the depravity and the resilience. Without that extreme event, the world remains more ambiguous. Progress is less certain. Values evolve in a fog. Let's explore how that shapes the soul of this alternate world, its culture, its identity, and the very stories people tell themselves. Pop culture without the pulse of war. Imagine, for a moment, a world without war movies. No Saving Private Ryan. No Schindler's List. No Band of Brothers. No Casablanca, even. In this world, filmmakers never inherit the moral vocabulary of World War II. There are no Nazis as convenient villains. No grand tales of resistance. No D-Day to recreate. Instead, cinema draws from other wells. The stories that shape this world are less about sacrifice and more about subtlety. The Cold War, muted and slower, provides fewer dramatic stakes. Spy thrillers still emerge. Perhaps the spy who came in from the cold still gets written, but the villains are less obvious. The battles more cerebral. Without the post-war boom, Hollywood evolves more slowly. The golden age fades with less spectacle. Science fiction still thrives, especially as space remains a mystery, but it lacks the urgency of competing ideologies. Even superhero stories change. Without fascism as a real-world template, villains become abstract. Power is portrayed not as the ability to destroy, but the challenge of restraint. Captain America? Perhaps he's never created. Or if he is, he's less a soldier and more a philosopher. The world still dreams, still tells stories, but they echo differently. Art without the abyss. Visual art, too, transforms. In our reality, the horrors of war fractured the artistic world. Abstract expressionism was born not just from aesthetics, but as a reaction to chaos. Picasso's Guernica captured the pain of air raids. Post-war artists wrestled with meaning in a broken world. Here, the world isn't broken the same way. Art is less confrontational, more meditative. Without the existential scream of war-torn Europe, painting and sculpture remain tied to older traditions longer. The break from realism still happens, but slower. The canvases of the 1960s are filled with quiet explorations of identity, nature, and solitude, not anguish. In literature, modernism still rises, but postmodernism arrives late. Without the disillusionment of total war, writers are less cynical. The great questioning of truth, structure, and authority still comes, but in whispers, not roars. Philosophy in a softer shadow. And what of the thinkers? In our timeline, philosophers like Hannah Arendt, Albert Camus, and Jean-Paul Sartre were shaped by the war, by totalitarianism, genocide, resistance. Their questions were forged in fire. What is evil? What is freedom? What does it mean to act? In this alternate world, those same minds still exist, but their concerns are more abstract. Arendt never watches the Eichmann trial. Camus writes not about plague as metaphor, but perhaps as mood. Sartre's existentialism still questions freedom, but without Nazi occupation, his urgency fades. Meanwhile, in the United States, the counterculture takes longer to bloom. The Beat generation still drifts, but the acid wave crashes later. The psychedelic movement, untethered from wartime trauma and Cold War anxiety, remains niche, more spiritual than political. Ideas still flow, but the rivers are calmer. Science without crisis. Scientific progress is another strange casualty of peace. Without war, there is less urgency to develop penicillin, radar, code breaking, or computing. Research still happens, but at a university's pace, not a general's. In medicine, public health advances continue, but major breakthroughs, like mass vaccination, trauma surgery, and battlefield triage, emerge more slowly. The push to build hospitals, train nurses, and mobilize medical systems lacks the catalytic shock of global war. Nuclear energy, too, is different. There is no Manhattan Project. No splitting of the atom under pressure. Physicists still uncover atomic secrets, but with less funding, less fear, less immediate purpose. The first nuclear reactors come decades later, and not as weapons, but as slow-burning power sources. In this world, science is less revolutionary, more evolutionary. Religion without revelation. World War II, in our world, broke and rebuilt many belief systems. Some found God in the ashes. Others lost faith entirely. The Holocaust, Hiroshima, and the brutality of human nature forced theologians and ordinary people to re-evaluate the meaning of suffering, evil, and salvation. Here, that reckoning never comes. Religions remain more traditional, less challenged. Christianity in the West maintains greater authority, untested by mass moral trauma. Judaism, while still rich and enduring, does not undergo the same resurgence of identity and diaspora-driven unity that the Holocaust created. Islamic nations remain more entwined with colonial rule longer. Religious revivalism, so often born in response to crisis, happens more subtly. Spirituality still grows. Questions are still asked. But the cosmic silence of Auschwitz and Nagasaki, the questions they forced into every prayer, remain unspoken. Human rights without witness. And finally, perhaps most profoundly, the very idea of human rights. In our timeline, the concept of universal rights, dignity, safety, freedom, emerged forcefully after the war. The world saw the camps, the bodies, the smoke, and said, never again. The United Nations was formed. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written. Genocide, once a theoretical term, became a legal reality. But in our alternate world, that clarity never crystallizes. There are still injustices, still dictators, still massacres, but without a singular, global crime to react to, the framework of international law evolves slower. There is no Nuremberg, no Geneva Conventions in their modern form. War crimes are rarely prosecuted. Refugees remain stateless longer. The world has fewer horrors, but also fewer tools to face them. Progress, once again, is gentler, but so are the guardrails. And so we close this part of the journey. The 1960s and 70s in this alternate world have none of the violence of World War, but also none of the urgency to overcome it. The culture, the science, the values, they all stretch gently toward the future, never knowing what they were spared, and never quite realizing what they missed. We'll continue in Part 4, exploring how this slow-turning world faces the 1980s and beyond. Until then, sleep softly. You're safe here, in this quiet world of what might have been. Still with me? Good. Let your breathing soften. Let your eyelids grow heavier. We're now in the final stretch of this part of our journey. The 1970s are drawing to a close. In our world, this decade was one of gas shortages, disco balls, and the final shudders of an empire in transition. But here, in this quieter timeline, the music is softer, the headlines smaller, the history just a little sleepier. Still, the wheels of time keep turning. Let's finish this chapter by exploring how this alternate world prepares to enter the 1980s. Not through the lens of war, but through evolution, slow, strange, and entirely its own. Protest without catalyst. Protest movements, in our timeline, often rose in opposition to conflict. The Vietnam War sparked student revolts, anti-establishment art, and a generation of political awakening. In this alternate world, without such a war to resist, what becomes of protest? It doesn't disappear, but it shifts focus. College campuses still simmer with dissent, but the targets are domestic. racial inequality, corporate corruption, gender discrimination, and the environment. Without Vietnam, there's no Kent State, no draft resistance, no anti-imperialist fever to unite disparate causes. Instead, activism becomes more issue-based, fragmented, less unified, but still loud. The civil rights movement, while delayed, continues into the 70s with broader coalitions. Feminism spreads, building not from Rosie the Riveter, but from academic critique and lived experience. LGBTQ+ rights begin their long struggle for recognition, spurred by local activism more than national trauma. The culture of protest lives, but it feels less revolutionary, more like a persistent hum than a thunderclap. Oil still rules the world. One crisis remains unchanged in many timelines: oil. The 1973 oil embargo, in our reality, exposed the West's dependence on Middle Eastern energy. It shocked economies, raised prices, and reoriented global strategy. In this alternate world, much the same happens, but for slightly different reasons. Without World War II, the Middle East's geopolitical position remains strong, perhaps stronger. With European empires lingering longer, oil-producing nations are slower to gain independence. But once they do, they hold even more leverage. The United States, not yet a global hegemon, has fewer tools to respond. The scramble for energy security becomes a defining issue of the late 70s, pushing governments to explore alternative fuels earlier, but with less funding and urgency than a war-shocked West might muster. Technology lags. Environmentalism grows. But global energy politics still revolve around the same black liquid and the tensions it brews. Terrorism without television. Here's another curious change: the nature of terrorism. In our timeline, many terrorist organizations gained global attention because of televised hijackings, hostage crises, and brutal attacks, often tied to Cold War politics or post-war grievances. But in this quieter world, media saturation grows more slowly. There is no Vietnam War beaming into living rooms. No Cold War standoffs turned into spectacle. The public is less accustomed to watching conflict unfold in real time. Terrorism still exists, born of ideology, nationalism, and desperation, but its reach is limited. Attacks may occur, but they're localized, less likely to be seen by the world. The emotional response is more regional, the policy shifts less global. The age of spectacle is still coming, but for now, it sleeps. Technology's waiting room. By the end of the 1970s, the personal computer is still a dream. Silicon Valley is a quiet orchard of possibilities, not a global engine of culture. Steve Jobs and Bill Gates exist, but without the explosive spark of military-funded computing, they are tinkering in obscurity, not revolutionizing the future. There is no internet, no cell phones, no digital revolution. Music is still analog. Letters still arrive in envelopes. Maps are still paper. In this world, 1979 feels more like 1959 with better colors. The future is waiting, but no one knows how close it is. Entering the 1980s, a strange stillness. And so, as the 1980s dawn, the world feels oddly in between. It is more peaceful, more stable, but also more uncertain. There are fewer enemies, but also fewer shared dreams. The Cold War is a cold breeze, not a storm. The United States is powerful, but not dominant. Europe is rich, but divided. The USSR is large, but sluggish. Asia is rising, but quietly. The planet is calm, but it is also drifting. Without the war to define it, the 20th century has no center.
No crucible.
No grand pivot. Just the slow turning of a planet that never burned. And as we close this part of the journey, and your thoughts begin to wander like leaves on a stream, remember this. Peace is not always perfect. Quiet is not always kind. But both offer space, space to imagine, space to rest, space to ask, what would we have become if we had never fallen? We'll pick up again in part 4, where we'll explore the world as it enters the information age, with no world war to shape it. Until then, sleep gently. You're safe in this alternate world. As we drift into the 1980s, the world in our alternate timeline feels curiously familiar, yet fundamentally altered. The Cold War has never truly heated up. There have been no mushroom clouds, no Berlin Wall, no proxy wars spanning continents. The great powers watch each other warily, but from a greater distance. The ideological contest is still there, but its fire is faint. And beneath that cool, cautious surface, something else is stirring. Not a bomb, not a battalion, but a screen,
Un circuit.
a signal. This is the beginning of the digital age, and in a world untouched by total war, the revolution arrives not with a bang, but with a whisper. Let's begin, as always, gently. The computer creeps in. In our world, military funding drove early computing. From the code-breaking machines of Bletchley Park to the missile tracking systems of the Pentagon, war shaped the direction, urgency, and structure of computing innovation. But here, that pressure never comes. The first computers still arrive, massive, room-sized, humming with primitive logic. But they're confined to universities, corporations, and research centers. There's no DARPA, no space race to push innovation, no Cold War to justify sprawling defense budgets. Instead, computer science is academic, curious, quieter. Personal computers begin to emerge in the late 1980s, not the mid-70s. The Apple II, in this timeline, is a boutique machine. IBM enters the home market cautiously. Microsoft still forms, but Windows doesn't arrive until the 1990s. It's slower, clunkier, less visionary. And yet, the momentum is there, undeniable. The idea of a machine that thinks, that calculates, that connects, it catches on, even without the rocket fuel of conflict. No internet. Yet. Without ARPANET, there is no internet in the 1980s. There's no World Wide Web. No email as we know it. No cyberpunk dreams of digital futures. Instead, communication stays analog. Faxes buzz. Telephones ring. Letters are still written by hand. But small networks begin to form. Computer clubs link machines together. Bulletin board systems appear. Early adopters experiment with primitive databases and file sharing. It's not the information superhighway. It's more like a trail through the woods. The web still comes. But much later. The 2000s, perhaps, not the 90s. And when it arrives into a different world, less centralized, less driven by military architecture, and more shaped by academia and commercial curiosity. The digital revolution is still real, but it's slower, softer, more like a tide than a tsunami. Media in transition. Television in this timeline is still dominant. Without the war, without global propaganda systems, without the need to create national myths, media is less ideological. News is local. Entertainment is traditional. Cable arrives, but slowly. MTV may still emerge, but it's more niche. CNN, if it exists, arrives not to cover Gulf Wars, but business, weather, and elections. Movies are still powerful, but the blockbuster model, pioneered by Jaws and Star Wars, both infused with post-war pacing and Cold War metaphors, is less dominant. Science fiction films are more speculative, less action-driven. Superhero franchises grow, but they are smaller, more philosophical. Batman is a noir detective. Superman is a parable. Without a unifying war, culture fragments. There are no Nazis to punch. No aliens standing in for Soviets. No dystopias built on mutually assured destruction. Art asks different questions. Sometimes deeper. Sometimes stranger. Politics without crisis. And what of the leaders? Ronald Reagan, in our world, was a Cold Warrior. His rhetoric, his defense build-up, his challenge to the Soviet Union, they all sprang from the memory of war and the fear of another. Here, he still rises. His charm, his optimism, they resonate. But his role is smaller. There's no Star Wars program. No tear down this war moment. No morning in America built on military might. Mikhail Gorbachev, too, still emerges in the USSR. But the Soviet Union, having never expanded aggressively, is less overstretched. There is no Eastern Bloc. No arms race to bankrupt it. Glasnost and Perestroika arrive, but with less desperation. The USSR lumbers on, slower to collapse. Or perhaps it evolves gradually, without headlines. In this world, there are no dramatic endings. Just slow dissolves. Borders blur. Walls never built, never fall. China's unknown path. Meanwhile, in the East, China remains enigmatic. Without Japanese occupation, without American involvement, its 20th century path shifts drastically. Perhaps the Civil War ends in a nationalist victory. Perhaps the communists win anyway, but without Soviet support, without World War II refugees, without the same revolutionary momentum. Either way, Mao Zedong may never become a global icon. There may be no great leap forward, no cultural revolution, no famine that kills tens of millions. By the 1980s, China is a large, developing nation, less isolated, less radical. Its economy grows slowly. The world doesn't yet fear, or fixate on, its rise. It is not a sleeping giant, just a quiet one. The global South in silence. Without decolonization sparked by war, much of the global South remains under indirect control longer. But by the 1980s, independence movements have surged regardless. Africa, Asia, and Latin America are now largely sovereign, but their stories unfolded more slowly. Their leaders are less known to the West. Their revolutions less televised. Latin America still experiences coups and crises, but without Cold War funding, they play out with less external manipulation. Fewer proxy conflicts. Less CIA. Less KGB. The global South finds its voice, but it whispers, not shouts. A planet on the edge of something new. And so we stand, at the dawn of the 1990s, in a world fundamentally different from our own. It is not a utopia. It is not a dystopia. It is something in between. A world where violence was not banished, but where the great, defining fire of World War II never came. And without that fire, some seeds never bloomed. Some weeds never grew. Some scars were never made. And some medicines were never invented. It is a world rich in peace, but also poorer in transformation. And now, as your body sinks deeper into sleep, and your mind begins to drift between thoughts like fog over still water, imagine the world, not as it is, but as it might have been. In Part 5, we'll step into the new millennium. We'll explore how this alternate 21st century begins, without 9/11, without global war, without the shadow of total destruction hanging over every decision. But for now, rest. You've earned it. Welcome back. As the early 2000s unfold in this world that never witnessed World War II, we find ourselves on familiar ground, but covered in unfamiliar footprints. There is still ambition, still conflict, still invention and resistance and dreams. But there is no 9/11, no war on terror, no sprawling US military bases stretched across a world once reshaped by global war. The balance of power is different. The fears are different. Even the silence feels different. Let's return to that world, peaceful, imperfect, and impossibly strange. The Twin Towers still stand. One of the most profound changes in this timeline is also one of the simplest to imagine, the skyline of New York City. The Twin Towers still rise over Lower Manhattan. Why? Because in this world, the United States never becomes the global military force it was in our reality. There are fewer foreign interventions. No Gulf War in 1991. No troops in Saudi Arabia. No global web of bases to provoke resentment and radicalization. Osama bin Laden exists, but his story is different. Al-Qaeda, if it forms at all, is less motivated by US presence in the Middle East. The militant backlash against American influence is weaker. The ideology may still simmer, but the fuse never lights. And so, the planes never fly. The towers never fall. The shock, the mourning, the war that followed, all of it remains a ghost. No war on terror. Without 9/11, there is no Patriot Act. No Homeland Security. No airport scanners. No color-coded threat levels. There is no invasion of Afghanistan. No Iraq War. No trillions of dollars spent. No loss of life measured in distant, dusty cities. American soldiers grow up, serve in peace, retire with memories of training drills, not desert firefights. And with no war on terror, the Muslim world is seen differently. Islamophobia still exists. Prejudice rarely needs a reason, but it is weaker, less codified. There are no Guantanamos, no black sites, no drones circling foreign skies. The 2000s in this world are quieter, more introspective, less defined by fear. Politics without polarization? It's tempting to imagine this peaceful world is also more unified politically. But politics, as always, finds its own battles. In the absence of 9/11, the US political scene remains contentious, but the arguments shift. The neoconservative rise never occurs. The evangelical nationalist surge is less prominent. George W. Bush still becomes president, perhaps, but he governs as a traditional conservative, not a wartime commander. His legacy is smaller, quieter, perhaps even forgettable. Barack Obama may still rise. His charisma, intelligence, and optimism still resonate. But without the war-weary, hope-hungry electorate of 2008, his victory may come later, or never. The dynamics of race, generational change, and global expectation all shift. Without Trumpism as a backlash to Obama-era liberalism, the polarization of American politics still happens, but differently. The culture wars burn more slowly. The internet, slower to mature, is less radicalizing, at least at first. There are divisions, always, but they smolder rather than explode. China in the spotlight. By the 2010s, China emerges as the world's quiet competitor. Without the Cold War or global wars to define superpowers, China rises without resistance. It is not feared, it is studied. Its model of state capitalism seems strange but stable. Its economy grows steadily. Its presence in Africa, Latin America, and Asia expands, not through conquest or ideology, but trade and infrastructure. There are tensions with the US over markets, currencies, and influence, but they are economic, not military. There is no arms race, no South China Sea brinkmanship, no fear of a Thucydides trap. Instead, the world's great powers circle each other cautiously, like stars in slow orbit. A global identity emerges. Another consequence of peace, a stronger global identity. Without the divisions of Cold War blocs, and without the traumas of war shaping memory, young people grow up thinking not in terms of empires or alliances, but networks, communities, conversations. International cooperation is not perfect, but it is more fluid. Climate change, pandemics, and human rights are not always met with unity, but they are framed as global problems, not national ones. The Internet, once finally widespread by the late 2000s, connects people without the same toxic urgency that rapid adoption often brings. Memes still go viral. Outrage still erupts. But there is less weaponization of platforms, less manipulation by foreign powers, less informational warfare disguised as free speech. Social media still shapes minds, but it doesn't divide them quite so deeply. Culture in the calm. What of the music, the art, the stories we tell? In this world, pop culture feels softer, not dull, but slower to shock. Without a generation shaped by war, then counterculture, then post-9/11 angst, the rhythms of culture pulse differently. Hip-hop still rises, but with fewer themes of war and resistance. Rock still echoes, but it lacks the Vietnam-born rebellion that once fueled it. Pop dominates. Folk music holds on longer. Jazz weaves into electronic. Genres drift more than clash.
Cinema embraces quieter storytelling.
Independent films dominate longer. Franchises still exist, but the mega blockbusters born of post-9/11 myth-making, The Avengers, Transformers, The Dark Knight, emerge more slowly and feel less urgent. Streaming platforms arrive in the late 2010s, not the early 2010s. Binge culture grows, but it blooms more slowly, without the same escape-driven intensity. And then, the pandemic. Yes, even in this world, the virus comes. In 2020, a novel coronavirus still emerges in China, transmitted by bats, spreading silently among travelers, making its way into crowded cities and narrow alleys. But the response is different. In this world, international cooperation is stronger. Health systems, not shaped by profit or nationalism, react earlier. The virus still spreads. People still suffer. But there is no Trump to downplay it. No Twitter to inflame it. No war-torn nations to hide it. Vaccines still take time. Lockdowns still occur. But the panic is muted. The conspiracy theories, slower to circulate. And so the pandemic becomes what it always was, a global health crisis. Not a political litmus test. Not a cultural battlefield. The losses are still real, but the division is less so. And now, as you drift deeper, as your breath steadies and your thoughts grow lighter, remember, history is not just what happens, it's what doesn't. It's the moments missed, the bombs that never fell, the speeches never given, the statues never built. In this world, this alternate world, we have wandered through quiet landscapes, through cities never bombed, through cultures never crushed, through hearts that broke in slower ways. In part 6, we'll explore what the future might look like from here, this strange, soft world that history forgot. But for now, let it all go. Let the noise fall away. Let the silence of peace carry you to sleep. The 2010s wind down, quietly. In our world, this decade brought fierce storms of identity, technology, and division. But here, in this version of history without the colossal weight of a Second World War, the currents are slower. The tide doesn't crash. It shifts, gently, subtly, carving the coastline of the future one grain of sand at a time. As you settle deeper into your blanket and let the hum of sleep draw near, we'll take one final stroll through the 2010s in this alternate world, pausing at the places where echoes are loudest, even in silence. No Brexit, no Trump, no nationalist wave. One of the strongest winds that blew through our real world was the return of nationalism. In the 2010s, economic anxiety, cultural friction, and global displacement stirred populist movements. Brexit, Trump, Brazil, Hungary, India. Everywhere, it seemed, the world turned inward. But in this alternate world, the fire never caught. Why? Because the seeds of modern populism were planted in soil fertilized by war. The refugee crises of Syria and Afghanistan. The uneven results of globalization built on post-Cold War markets. The fear of cultural dilution, fed by memories of global trauma. Here, those elements exist, but not together. Not with the same weight. The European Union is less united, yes, but also less burdened. There is no migrant wave fleeing NATO bombings. Britain, slower to join the EU decades ago, remains loosely attached, but never feels the same fury that led to Brexit. In the United States, the cultural clash of the early 2000s, post 9/11 security versus liberal identity politics, never ignites. Trump may still be famous, still loud, but he is not a vessel for national rage, just a billionaire with a camera and a catchphrase. The nationalist wave never swells. It ripples, but it doesn't rise. The digital age takes root. By the end of the 2010s, the internet is fully integrated into daily life, even in this slower world. But its shape is different. Without Cold War architectures, without rapid military innovation, without the urgency of surveillance and cyber warfare, the internet is less centralized, less commodified. Google exists, Facebook too, but they arrive slower. They grow less dominant. Governments regulate earlier, not later. Privacy is not a lost battle, but an ongoing conversation. Users remain cautious, not because of breaches, but because the platforms never earned blind trust. TikTok may still exist, but it's seen more as art, less as algorithm. Twitter is more academic, less inflammatory. Reddit is more library, less battlefield. Social media connects, but doesn't control. Climate, still the crisis. One thing, however, doesn't change. The climate. Carbon emissions remain high. Fossil fuels still dominate. The Industrial Revolution was never undone. The delay in technology, the slower rise of green energy, leaves the planet warming at a similar pace. But public response is different. With fewer distractions, fewer wars, and stronger international cooperation, climate treaties are signed earlier. Not as reaction, but as preparation. Not all countries agree, but many do. The Paris Agreement, or its alternate equivalent, is more ambitious. The Green New Deal becomes a global proposal, not a partisan dream. The youth still march. The scientists still warn. But they are heard, if not always heeded. Progress is slow, but real. Global culture without a wound. Perhaps the most interesting difference in this world is this. Humanity doesn't carry the same scars. There is no Holocaust.
No mushroom cloud.
No generation of soldiers traumatized by mechanized death. No rebuilt cities haunted by rubble and ghosts. The world remembers its violence, from World War I, from colonialism, from smaller conflicts, but it is not defined by it. The stories passed down through families are different. The lullabies, the warnings, the memorials. There are no greatest generation myths. No never again chants echoing through school halls. There is no Anne Frank. No Hiroshima Peace Museum. No Normandy graveyards lined with white crosses. In some ways, this is a blessing. But in others, it leaves a strange void. Without great sorrow, there is less shared resilience, less shared purpose, less hard-won empathy. The world is softer, but it has forgotten what softness costs. The world at the edge. And so, as 2020 arrives, the planet stands at a threshold. In our world, this year marked a kind of climax. Pandemic, protest, polarization. But here, the mood is steadier. Not passive, but patient. The people of this world feel more like gardeners than firefighters. Tending, watching, waiting. They do not fear the end. They simply wonder what's next. And now, as you curl deeper into sleep, wrapped in blankets and possibility, remember this. The greatest difference in this world is not what happened. It's what didn't. No cities fell. No families fled. No generation sacrificed its youth on beaches and battlefields. But also, no truths were forged in fire. Peace shaped this world. But it shaped it gently. Too gently, perhaps. We'll continue in part 6, where we'll step into the future, 2050 and beyond, in this alternate world. No war. No global collapse. Just the slow, strange blooming of something entirely new. Until then, drift quietly. You are safe. Welcome back, traveler. You've journeyed with me across decades, through the silence where bombs never fell, through cities that were never leveled, through generations that rose not in the ashes of war, but in the fog of uninterrupted peace. Now we drift into the future. The year is 2050. The world, as ever, is changing. But here, it has changed, differently. Not because of what it endured, but because of what it avoided. Let's take one last deep breath. Let your body soften. Let your thoughts lift like dust in sunlight. And step into tomorrow. The shape of nations. By 2050, the map of the world has not been redrawn by wars, but by trade, migration, and environmental change. There are fewer collapsed states, fewer failed nations, no war-ravaged Syria,
No post-war Korea.
no occupied Iraq, no NATO-led interventions or failed Arab Springs shaped by military power. Instead, borders shift slowly, as culture and climate nudge them into new patterns. Low-lying nations have redrawn their coastlines. Island states negotiate land deals before vanishing beneath rising seas. Coastal cities build walls, or move inland. Millions are displaced, not by tanks, but by tides. Africa has emerged as a global power bloc, not through post-war aid, but through long-term investment and regional cooperation. The African Union, slow to form but steady, now rivals Europe in cohesion. Europe remains a quilt, more interconnected than ever, but never unified. No European Union in the traditional sense. No shared currency, but strong ties, woven over decades of diplomacy, culture, and quiet necessity. And the United States is different, still powerful, still vast, but humbler, less militarized, more inward. Its influence is not carried by soldiers or sanctions, but by ideas, music, film, technology, education. A superpower not through force, but through familiarity. The technology that finally bloomed. By 2050, the digital revolution has finally come into full bloom. Slower than in our world, but perhaps healthier. Artificial intelligence is integrated, not dominant. It advises, assists, interprets, but it doesn't control. The panic of job automation came late, and governments had time to adapt. Universal basic income, trialed in a dozen countries, now covers nearly half the globe. Smart cities have emerged, not as surveillance zones, but as ecosystems. Traffic flows with intelligent coordination. Waste is minimized. Power grids are self-healing. Public spaces are designed for slowness, for walking, for resting, for gathering, not for efficiency alone. Virtual reality is common, but used with intention, not to escape, but to explore. Museums without walls, classrooms without borders, therapy in immersive memory gardens. The internet is still messy, still loud, but better managed. Early regulation prevented monopolies. Privacy protections are strong. Disinformation exists, but the immune system of digital literacy is stronger here. Technology is not a runaway train. It is a lantern, held carefully. A culture of caution. Without the deep scars of war, this world is more cautious in its art. Its stories are softer, more speculative, less concerned with apocalypse, more with adaptation. There are fewer war films, fewer dystopias. The popular imagination has not been primed for disaster. Instead, it wonders, what else could we become? The biggest films of the 2040s are slow-burning sci-fi, climate operas, stories about interspecies diplomacy, about time-traveling linguists, about underwater civilizations learning to breathe together. Literature leans philosophical. Poetry returns to popularity. Performance art blends with neuroscience. Museums host exhibits you can feel as heat on your skin, or hear as memories not your own. It is a culture shaped by curiosity, not by survival. Religion and reflection. Religion persists, but with more room to breathe. Without wars framed by faith. Without crusades disguised as liberation. Without the need to weaponize belief, religion remains personal, flexible, sacred, but not sanctimonious. The Abrahamic faiths still guide billions, but they are more focused on ecology, equity, and ethics. Interfaith councils hold more sway than any single cleric. The old conflicts, Jerusalem, Mecca, Rome, exist more in history books than headlines. New spiritualities rise, based on consciousness, on climate, on interconnectedness. Worship is quieter, less hierarchical, more collective. And more than ever, people are free not to believe, and to still be welcomed fully. Climate and community. By 2050, climate change has not been solved, but it has been faced. This world, shaped by long-term thinking, began preparing earlier. Solar power is dominant. Carbon taxes are global. Rewilding projects stretch across continents. Oceans are monitored like nervous systems. Cities grow upward, not outward. Still, the seas are rising. Heat waves claim lives. Storms remake coastlines. But people know this is their fight. Not as heroes, but as caretakers. There is less denial, more humility. And with that humility comes a strange, soft hope. What we gained and what we missed. Now, before we leave this imagined world, we must ask, was this the better timeline? In many ways, yes. There was no genocide on an industrial scale, no nuclear arms race, no cities reduced to ash in a single flash, no young men returning home with missing limbs and haunted eyes.
No Holocaust. No Hiroshima.
There was no Cold War, no endless war, no legacy of fear handed down like an heirloom. But there was also no global awakening. No moment when the world looked at itself and said, enough. No shared trauma to build a new world upon. In this peaceful world, many things came later. Civil rights, women's equality, technological progress, climate action. Sometimes, pain is a teacher. Sometimes, catastrophe clarifies. This world avoided the pain. And in doing so, it wandered longer in the dark. Now, let your breath slow. Let this future slip behind your eyelids like a dream you almost remember. In part 7, we'll return from the stars and look inward. How would our inner lives, our psychology, philosophy, and personal meaning shift in a world without World War? But for now, sleep. You are safe. You're still here. That's good. As the imagined 2050 stretches out before us, we've spoken of nations and cities, of technologies and climates. But now, let's turn inward. Let's consider not the shape of the world, but the shape of a single life within it. How do people think in this world? How do they love? What do they fear? What do they dream of? Close your eyes if they aren't closed already. Let yourself become one of them, a citizen of a world shaped not by fire, but by the slow, drifting currents of peace. Memory without trauma. In our own world, the 20th century is remembered through rupture. The Second World War cleaved history in two. There was before, and there was after. Cities were rebuilt with the past in mind. Monuments rose like scars. Generations were taught history not to remember, but to never forget. Here, there is no such rupture. Yes, history exists, but it flows without fracture. Schools teach not of genocide and global combat, but of slow reforms, policy shifts, and diplomatic delays. History is a river, not a cliff. And because there is no moral reckoning like Nuremberg or Hiroshima, the collective memory is gentler, but also shallower. Without pain, the lessons come softer. A culture that does not have to heal also forgets how to remember. Elders share fewer tales of horror, fewer warnings. Youth are not raised on stories of resistance or rebuilding. They are not burdened, but also not braced. Their memories are lighter, but perhaps more fragile. Love without displacement. What happens to love in a world where millions are not uprooted by war? In our own world, romance was often born in exile, in barracks, on ships, across borders, in refugee camps and relocation centers, letters written by candlelight, photographs tucked in helmets. Here, love grows at home. Fewer couples are separated by oceans. Fewer children are born in the margins of loss. Family trees stretch evenly, without sudden breaks or abrupt endings. And yet, love is no less intense. It just comes with fewer goodbyes. Dating in 2050 is deeply digital, not the frantic, algorithm-driven swiping of our world, but something softer, slower, virtual walks, memory sharing, AI-assisted compatibility, not to sort people, but to introduce them gently. Marriage is common, but not mandatory. Chosen families flourish. Long-term friendship is seen as sacred. Cohabitation, care, and connection come in many forms. In the absence of war, the language of love is different. There are fewer poems about waiting, but more about staying. Work and worth. Work in 2050 has changed, but perhaps less than we might expect. Automation has spread, but incrementally. Without war-funded innovation, it evolved steadily. Jobs shifted gradually. Most adults now work fewer hours. Universal basic income is common in developed nations. And so, work is more about choice than survival. Artisanship returns. People find pride in maintenance, in service, in growing food, in caring for others. Prestige is not just for coders and CEOs, but for composters, midwives, and teachers. With less trauma to escape, there is less obsession with speed. Slowness becomes a value. And so, a strange kind of dignity returns. People define themselves not by their productivity, but by their presence. Faith and doubt. What does faith mean in a world without genocide or global war? It still flourishes, but it is less reactive. Religion in 2050 is local, lived, and dialogical. Temples, mosques, churches, and synagogues still exist, but they share space with community gardens, libraries, and wellness centers. There is no global moral outrage to sharpen belief. No theological struggle over suffering. Instead, faith becomes more focused on ecology, ethics, and empathy. Interfaith rituals become common: shared fasts, shared feasts, shared grief. And for those who do not believe, secular humanism thrives. Not as a counterpoint to faith, but as a companion, a shared moral project, a quiet agreement that kindness matters. Mental health in a softer age. Perhaps nowhere is the impact of a warless century more evident than in the realm of mental health. In our world, trauma cast long shadows. Generations carried invisible wounds. The field of psychology was forged in part to treat the scars of soldiers, survivors, and systems of violence. Here, those wounds still exist. Humans are always vulnerable, but they are fewer. And so, psychology becomes not only about healing, but about growing. Therapists help people not just recover, but flourish. Emotional literacy is taught in schools. Mindfulness is not a trend, but a norm. Therapy is as routine as a checkup. Loneliness is treated not as pathology, but as a call for connection. There are still suicides, still sadness, but there is less shame, less stigma, less silence. And with that comes peace. The new fears. A world without world war is not without fear. But the fears are different. No nuclear holocaust. No fascist rise. No red menace. Instead, people fear the slow things. Climate change, biodiversity collapse, loneliness, a loss of meaning in a digital world, apathy. They fear forgetting what mattered. They fear a kind of sleepwalking. And so they look for new myths, new metaphors, new stories to anchor themselves to something deeper. Not stories of survival, but stories of becoming. And now, as the 2050s roll quietly forward, and the imagined sunlight glows softer behind your eyelids, you might begin to wonder, what would you be like in this world? Without inherited trauma, without ancestral war stories, without the need to be brave every day, What would your softness look like? What would your stillness teach? Let that question carry you into the dark. Let your breath steady. Let this world fold around you. In Part 7, we'll explore how the absence of World War II reshapes the human psyche, philosophy, and meaning itself, how a world without war might dream, believe, and define truth. But for now, rest. Let this peaceful future hold you. You are safe here. You're still with me. We've wandered through the politics and technologies of this imagined future, and then deeper, into the minds, memories, and emotions of the people living in it. But let's now step into some of the most universal experiences of being human. What does education look like without the driving force of global conflict? What does aging feel like when you were never forged by crisis? And how do people think of themselves, not as citizens of wartime empires or survivors of catastrophe, but simply as humans? Let's keep drifting. Learning without a looming threat. In our own world, the 20th century education system was shaped by urgency. Wartime mobilization forced nations to teach faster, standardize harder, and prepare young minds for survival, patriotism, and production. In this alternate world, the tone is different. Schools are slower. Not less rigorous, just less anxious. Curricula focus more on questions than answers. Students are not taught what to fear, but how to understand. History lessons do not circle the world wars. They explore climate, migration, storytelling, and systems. Children are not told never again, because that scale of horror never came. Instead, they are asked, what if, and what now? Languages are emphasized. Conflict resolution is taught early. Philosophy begins in elementary school, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Test scores still matter, but emotional intelligence matters more. There is less us versus them. Because them never became the enemy. Aging in a world without collapse. In 2050, people are living longer. That part hasn't changed. But what has changed is the way old age is understood. Without a world war to traumatize their youth, the elders of this time carry different kinds of wisdom. They speak not of battles and ration lines, but of slow change, of watching forests grow back, of seeing cities shift shapes. They are not veterans of war. They are veterans of patience. Retirement is more fluid. Many work part-time into their 70s, not from necessity, but because community engagement is common, not transactional. Elders mentor, advise, and collaborate. They aren't dismissed, they are folded into life's rhythm. Healthcare is more holistic, less overwhelmed by post-war triage systems, less privatized, more cooperative. Death, when it comes, is met with more ceremony and less regret. And legacy is not measured in medals or survival stories, but in gardens planted, letters written, and memories passed on gently. What it means to be human. In this world, without a war that redefined nations, identity is more fluid. People see themselves less as Americans or Germans or Chinese, more as members of humanity, or the planet, or communities that blend across cultures and borders. The idea of us versus them still exists, but it's thinner, worn down not by battles, but by dialogue, connection, time. Even race is understood differently. Without the Holocaust, the concept of race did not become as sharply dissected by moral outrage. Without WW2 era propaganda, post-colonial panic, or forced population movements, the idea of identity grew along different lines. Slower, messier, but sometimes softer. Gender, too, has shifted. In a world that never conscripted men en masse, or forced women into factory lines overnight, the lines between roles blurred differently. Without Rosie the Riveter, there was no immediate call to arms for feminism, but also no return to rigid domesticity after the war. Gender identity, in this world, unfolded over time. Less politicized, still contested, but less violently. People define themselves more by what they care about than what they were born as. And that changes everything. Connection without crisis. What brings people together when they've never had to rebuild a broken world? In this timeline, it is not trauma that unites people, but imagination. The most popular global holidays are not memorials, but festivals of creativity, storytelling, invention, peace. Virtual gatherings are frequent, but not isolating. People meet in shared digital spaces to meditate, co-create, and even dream together, guided lucid dreams in haptic group simulators. Sleep is no longer private. It's sometimes shared. Without mass displacement, there are fewer diasporas, but global nomadism still thrives. People live in 5 cities before they turn 30. Their home is their journal, their playlists, their communities of interest. Religion, family, nation, all still exist. But they are less like cages, and more like gardens. And so, as we bring part 6 to a close, and your body softens with the weightlessness of sleep, let this thought linger in your breath. This world is not better because it avoided pain. It is different because it was never forced to learn through suffering. There are lessons it never had to learn, and others it may never fully understand. But there is beauty in that too. In part 7, we will explore meaning itself. In a world without global collapse, how do people find purpose? What do they live for, when survival was never in question? But for now, let yourself fade into this calm future. You're not escaping history. You're imagining the one that might have been. Hello again. Tonight, we drift not through battlefields or borders, but through the quiet spaces of the mind, through libraries and moonlit walks, through long conversations at the edge of sleep. Because in this world without the Second World War, the greatest struggle humanity faces isn't for land, or power, or peace. It's for meaning. What do we live for, when survival isn't the story? What becomes sacred when suffering never defined us? Take a breath. Let it out slowly. This part is soft. Philosophy without catastrophe. In our world, the 20th century tore open the human mind. The Holocaust forced ethics to evolve. Hiroshima forced science to look inward. World War II birthed existentialism, not just as a philosophy, but as a mood. Camus, Sartre, Arendt, they were voices in the rubble, asking what it means to be human when humanity fails itself. But here, in this quieter world, those questions come differently. Without genocide or apocalypse, philosophy drifts into other waters. It is still existential, but gentler. Thinkers ask not, how do we live with evil? But how do we live with plenty? There are no urgent manifestos.
No tortured cries.
Instead, philosophy becomes slow, ecological, interpersonal, less about right and wrong, and more about balance, interdependence, continuity. The dominant voices of this world are not Camus or Derrida, but biologists, poets, and systems theorists. And their question is not what is truth, but what is enough. Religion as reflection, not reaction. When people are not traumatized into prayer, faith transforms. In our world, Many turned to religion in the face of destruction. Others turned away from it. But in both cases, it was reaction to grief, to injustice, to awe. Here, the divine emerges more as curiosity than as comfort. People worship not to be saved, but to stay connected. Pilgrimage becomes less about penance, more about pattern recognition. Spirituality isn't a shield against chaos, it's a lens for complexity. Temples are still built, but they are open on all sides, designed for conversation, not confession. The sacred texts of this world, they are just as old, but interpreted differently, with less fear, less vengeance, more metaphor. Even atheism, here, is softer, not a war against dogma, but a walk through wonder. In this world, belief is not about certainty. It's about attention. Art without agony. What of the artist, in a world without global war? In our timeline, some of the most profound art came from pain. Frida Kahlo's self-portraits, Picasso's Guernica, the bleak cinema of Bergman, the anxious jazz of post-war America. But here, art is less desperate. Still necessary, still vital, but drawn from stillness, not rupture. Music is ambient, layered, less performative. Visual art returns to form, to nature, to sensation. Literature leans introspective, not nihilistic. There are fewer great movements.
No post-war modernism. No punk rebellion.
But there is more continuity. A painting here might take 10 years. A film might show a tree aging over decades. A novel might follow a family not through disaster, but through daily tenderness. And the question asked by artists isn't, what does it all mean? It's, can you feel this, too? Purpose without enemies. Here's a deeper question. If war gives us heroes, what gives us purpose in its absence? In our world, so many found meaning in resistance, in reconstruction, in standing against something. Here, purpose arises not from conflict, but from contribution. A person finds identity not through defiance, but through creation, through care, through curiosity. Instead of defining themselves by what they've lost, people here define themselves by what they offer. Not I fought, but I taught. Not I survived, but I shaped. Even in politics, this shift shows. Leaders are not elected for strength, but for clarity, compassion, longevity, and purpose is not national, but planetary. To be human, here, means to be a participant, not a pawn. The problem of stillness. But peace is not always easy. There is a cost to this gentle timeline. Attention. When life is not a struggle, people sometimes drift. Without the pressure of crisis, some grow complacent, unmoored. They invent struggles, manufacture outrage, seek adrenaline in echo chambers and artificial competition. Mental health here is better, but not perfect. Because without a shared story of survival, meaning becomes personal, and sometimes lonely. Some long for a grand challenge. Some imagine wars that never happened. Some write histories of what might have been, just to feel connected to something greater. Perhaps, someone like you. Listening now, in the dark, wondering what your story would be, in a world like this. A quiet conclusion. And so, as we begin to close part 7, remember this. In this alternate world, the greatest victory wasn't peace. It was presence. People learned, not through war, but through wonder. They found purpose, not in sacrifice, but in stillness. And they dreamed, not of glory, but of harmony. In Part 8, we'll explore what legacies emerge in such a world, how this peaceful Earth prepares for space, for extinction, for transcendence. But for now, let the questions fade. Let the stillness hold you. And sleep. You are safe here. Still with me? Good. As your breath settles and the quiet wraps around you like fog over calm water, we continue through this world not shaped by destruction, but by drift. We've talked about purpose and philosophy, but even in peace, people seek stories, narratives that bind, truths that endure. And when those truths are no longer carved in the fire of war, they must be discovered in new ways. Let's explore how that discovery unfolds. The absence of never again. In our world, the phrase never again carries immense weight. It was born from the Holocaust, from Hiroshima, from the ruins of Berlin and the ashes of Warsaw. It defined global ethics for a century. Here, that phrase never becomes a mantra, because it never happened. There is no industrial genocide, no nuclear devastation, no firebombing of cities that turned families into shadows on the walls. So this world has no moral rallying cry. And that is complicated. Because moral clarity, as painful as its origins may be, gives people a compass. Without it, people here drift more easily into ethical ambiguity. They are slower to recognize cruelty, because they have never seen it institutionalized. Justice is more procedural, less passionate. Law replaces outrage. Fairness replaces fire. In this world, people still care. But they care more quietly. Education of the soul. To counter that drift, new tools emerge. Education in this timeline focuses on internal development, not just information. Children are taught not just how to read, or calculate, or analyze, but how to reflect, how to meditate, how to engage in dialogue, how to sit with ambiguity without rushing to answer. Philosophy is not an elective, it's a foundation. Students are asked early, what is beauty? What is kindness? What do you owe the future? There is no pledge of allegiance in most schools, but there is a daily ritual of stillness, a moment of collective breathing, not prayer, but presence. The goal is not obedience, it is self-awareness. Because in this world, peace requires maintenance, not vigilance against enemies, but against apathy. Artistic legacy without ruin. We spoke already of art born not from agony, but from attention. But what becomes of legacy? In our world, many of the 20th century's greatest artists were shaped by exile, trauma, and loss. Their works endure because they spoke to something unbearable. In this world, legacy is measured differently. There are no towering monuments to fallen soldiers, no museums of horror, no epics of ruin. Instead, artists become part of the civic fabric. A poet might be a public servant, crafting verses for city rituals. A composer might write symphonies that evolve over decades, performed annually as the seasons turn. There are fewer masterworks, but more shared works. Art is not for immortality, but for continuity. Spirituality and silence. In our world, great suffering drove people inward, or upward, to God, to meaning, to silence. In this world, the silence came first. So spirituality evolved in parallel with peace. It is less hierarchical, less punitive, less focused on sin and salvation. Instead, it centers on awe, on presence, on the humility of being alive on a planet that spins in silence. There are no crusades,
No jihads.
no forced conversions. But there are sacred forests, underwater temples, communal fasts not for discipline, but for unity. People still pray. But more often, they listen. The problem of freedom. Freedom here is abundant. But it brings its own kind of weight. In our world, freedom was often won through blood, rebellion, and sacrifice. Here, it arrived slowly. It was not seized, but granted. And sometimes, people don't know what to do with it. They struggle to define boundaries, to find discipline, to make commitments. A culture of infinite choice sometimes leads to indecision, to disconnection, to lives spent sampling, but never staying. In response, new movements arise. Not authoritarian, but anchoring. They emphasize commitment, community, roots. Not as a rejection of freedom, but as its fulfillment. Loneliness and connection. Even in peace, people still feel lonely. In fact, in this world, loneliness is more visible, because there is less distraction from it. There are no war zones to compare pain against. No crises to frame solitude as luxury. No ration lines to turn every meal into communion. Instead, loneliness appears softly. In digital silence. In overstimulated minds. In hearts that never had to harden, but also never learned how to open. And so, this world invests deeply in connection. Urban design prioritizes chance encounters. Public rituals mark all stages of life. Grief is communal. Joy is shared. Technology aids connection, but doesn't replace it. There are no social media empires. But there are millions of virtual fireside circles. And now, as you feel the gentle gravity of sleep tug at your thoughts, consider this. Even without war, the human soul still aches. It still wonders, still fears, still reaches. But in this world, it reaches not to rebuild, but to grow. And sometimes, that's harder. In Part 8, we'll turn our eyes upward. What does space exploration look like in a world without Cold War rockets and moonrace rivalries? What dreams fill the stars, when Earth never burned? But for now, sleep. Let your breath deepen. You are safe here. Welcome back. Tonight, we leave the atmosphere. We've walked through the stillness of a peaceful Earth. No world war, no Cold War, no urgent arms race to thrust rockets skyward. Now, we gaze upward. Into a sky less burdened by rivalry. Into a future where space was not conquered, but courted. Close your eyes. Let your body feel light. You're no longer lying in a bed. You're drifting between planets. Welcome to the cosmos of a warless world. No space race. No Sputnik. No moonshot. In our world, the Cold War lit a fuse beneath space exploration. Sputnik was fear and awe. Apollo was ambition and defiance. NASA was born of military budgets and geopolitical prestige. But here, those flames never caught. There is no USSR racing the US for the stars.
No Kennedy era Pramisis.
No flag planted on the moon in 1969. Instead, progress comes slowly. The first satellites arrive in the late 1970s, not the 1950s. They're used for weather, research, and early communications.
No spy satellites.
No military payloads. Just curiosity, climbing skyward. Manned spaceflight follows in the 1980s, but it's scientific, not symbolic. The first humans orbit Earth not in competition, but in cooperation. There is no Cold War, so there's no space war. Only space wonder. International from the start. In this timeline, there is no NASA and Roscosmos vying for dominance. Instead, space agencies form as international cooperatives from the very beginning. The first orbiting stations are not flags in the sky. They're floating labs with scientists from 10 different countries, sharing experiments, languages, and meals. The idea of owning space never takes root. There are no Star Wars defense initiatives, no militarization of orbit, no moon base proposals driven by paranoia. Instead, space remains neutral, peaceful, vast. A place not for projection of power, but for the pursuit of perspective. The moon, visited late, loved deeply. In our world, humanity stood on the moon in 1969, then left, and didn't return. Here, the moon is approached more cautiously, but embraced more fully. The first manned landing occurs in the 1990s. Not a televised event, but a quiet milestone. Scientists, not astronauts. No quotes about steps or mankind, just soil samples, solar readings, and soft ore. A small station is built by 2010. By 2050, it's a lunar observatory. Solar-powered. Staffed seasonally. A place of study, not strategy. Children grow up dreaming not of becoming heroes, but of becoming caretakers of the sky. Mars, a shared dream. Mars is not the next frontier in a race. It's a collective promise. The mission takes decades to prepare. No billionaire space barons. No flags. Just slow planning. Shared budgets. Caution and care. The first robotic missions in the 2020s paved the way for human travel in the 2040s. Not to colonize. Not to escape Earth. But to learn. The first Martian station is small. Fragile. It studies climate, geology, and the possibilities of life, not for us, but for itself. And the first humans to walk its surface are not pioneers or soldiers. They are scientists, poets, listeners.
No militarized orbit.
No space force. In our world, low Earth orbit is crowded with weapons, surveillance, and strategic advantage. In this timeline, it remains largely clean. There is no militarized GPS, no anti-satellite missiles, no space force. Instead, orbital platforms focus on climate monitoring, global communications, deep space observation, cultural preservation. Satellites transmit art and music to distant probes. Messages in every language float beyond Pluto. Earth's radio noise is a lullaby, not a warning. The idea of dominating space never occurs. Only dwelling in it. A culture shaped by stars. Because space was never weaponized, it remains sacred. Children learn astronomy not as a technical field, but as a form of reverence. Star charts are read like poems. Planetary motion is taught through dance. Constellations are not myths of war, but stories of ecology, balance, and home. Religions integrate cosmic theology. Some imagine the stars as memories of ancestors. Others see them as guides, not to heaven, but to perspective. Art installations orbit the Earth, floating museums, slow-turning sculpture gardens visible only from above. Looking up doesn't remind people of fear. It reminds them of smallness and connection. SETI, signals, and stillness. In this timeline, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence continues, but with patience. No rush to reply. No rush to colonize. If we receive a signal, it will be met with poetry, not protocol. A call to listen more carefully to ourselves before answering anyone else. If we are alone, the silence is treated not as loneliness, but as opportunity. We are not racing to be first. We are learning to be ready. And now, as you sink deeper into the warmth of your sheets and the silence of your mind, imagine a night sky not seen through binoculars or telescopes, but felt. Felt as breath, as belonging, as a shared sky beneath which no bombs ever fell. In Part 9, we will begin to close our journey, asking what lessons this alternate history holds for us, here, in the world that did live through the fire. But for now, sleep. Let your breath join the rhythm of the stars. You are safe. You are loved. You are home. Still floating? Let's stay up here a little longer. As the stars surround us and your breath deepens into the quiet rhythms of sleep, we return to the question not just of where we're going, but why. In this timeline, space exploration was never driven by conquest. So what fills that space? The answer is awe. Let's follow it. Exploration as a form of meditation. In our world, the space race was fast, urgent, and loud. Here, it's more like prayer. Launches are public but not patriotic. They are slow, intentional, often ceremonial. Before each liftoff, silence is observed, not for fallen astronauts, but for the Earth they're leaving behind. Viewers don't cheer, they listen. The launch isn't a victory. It's an offering. Space is approached not as territory, but as temple. Space education, a childhood of wonder. In this timeline, education about space begins early, but not through models of rockets or national flags. Children study astronomy through storytelling. Every planet has its own mythology. The asteroid belt is not just a field of rock, but a memory of a world that almost was. They learn that Saturn's rings are temporary, that stars are born and die like people, that the moon pulls not just tides, but time itself. Every lesson is a lullaby. Every chart, a mural. There is no fear of the void. Only fascination with the unknown. Cultural rituals and cosmic rhythms. Space becomes part of life on Earth in ways more emotional than economic. People gather for meteor showers as others gather for festivals. Lunar eclipses prompt communal silence. Solstices mark not just seasons, but celestial alignment. Every full moon has a name, not just from old traditions, but new ones born from global consensus. The most watched global event isn't a sports final or election. It's the synchronized turning off of lights during Earth Day's Night of Stars, when the skies darken enough for even the most crowded cities to glimpse the Milky Way. Artists among the astronauts. Space agencies recruit not just scientists, but artists. Each crew includes a poet to record the mission in feeling, a painter to capture what no camera can, a musician to play the hum of the ship back to the stars. In the first Martian mission, the first thing unpacked is not a drill, but a canvas. On the moon, there's a sculpture garden made from lunar dust. And in orbit, a satellite floats containing a gallery of Earth's lullabies, recorded by children in every language. Space and spirituality. In this world, many religions see space not as an escape, but as reflection. The stars are reminders, not of conquest, but of humility. Pilgrimages to space are spiritual, not touristic. The first religious ceremony on the moon is not to claim it, but to bless it. Not a flag, a prayer. Not we were here, but we are grateful. And the question is never, are we alone? It's what are we becoming? Colonization reimagined. In our world, Mars is discussed as the next Earth, a backup, an escape hatch. Here, there is no such language. Mars is not colonized. It is visited, respected, studied. The idea of terraforming is considered, but slowly, ethically, as if the planet's soul is part of the equation. If life is found, however microbial, it is honored, protected. Mars is not a solution. It is a sibling. Death among the stars. Even death looks different in space. In this world, when a spacefarer dies, whether in orbit or on a distant planet, the ritual is poetic. Their body is not buried, but returned to space, wrapped in cloth printed with the constellations of their birth night. Their story is added to the archive of Earth, a digital memory stream of every astronaut's dreams, regrets, and favorite smells from home. Not heroes, just humans, who looked up and went. A new mythology. And so, slowly, space becomes our new mythology. Not for fear, not for escape, but for remembering who we are when we're not fighting, not burning, not running, just wondering, just reaching, just listening. And as your body softens and your thoughts float far beyond the sky, let this final image carry you. A quiet Earth, bathed in blue and green, encircled not by weapons, but by whispers. Satellites of song, ships of science, and people not trying to conquer space, just trying to deserve it. In Part 9, we'll return to Earth to reflect on what this alternate world might teach our world, how imagining peace can help us build it, even now. But for now, sleep. The stars are still watching. Welcome back. The dream has carried us far, through peaceful nations, quiet revolutions, gentle technologies, and skies that never bore the weight of war. But now, we return. Not with a crash, but with a question. What do we do with this story? What does a warless world, imagined in the folds of sleep, say to a world like ours, shaped by fire? Let's find out, slowly. The power of the what if. Alternate history is not just fiction. It's philosophy. It's a way of holding our reality at arm's length, turning it in the light, asking, could we have chosen differently? Could we still? When we imagine a world without World War II, we aren't erasing history. We're illuminating it. We see what we lost, but also what we learned. And sometimes, we see paths we didn't know were there. Paths that may still lie ahead. Grief as teacher. There's no denying it. World War II was a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. Tens of millions dead. Cities gone. Families broken. Atrocities so deep they reshaped law, ethics, memory. And yet, so much of what we call progress came through that crucible. The United Nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Decolonization. Global cooperation. The recognition of genocide as a crime. The rebuilding of Europe. The civil rights movement. The creation of Israel. The space age. even our understanding of trauma, of memory, of what it means to be human. In the world we imagined, those things come slower, or not at all. So we must ask, did it take the fire to build the light? And if so, how do we honor the fire without needing it again? Peace as practice, not outcome. The peaceful world we imagined wasn't perfect. It was slower, softer, but not immune to confusion, loneliness, complacency. Because peace is not a guarantee of meaning. It is a context for it. In our world, peace must be practiced, tended, cultivated like a fragile plant. It doesn't descend from treaties. It grows from how we speak, how we listen, how we remember, and how we imagine. And imagination may be the most powerful peace tool we have. The memory of what didn't happen. There's a strange kind of grief for things that never existed. In imagining this alternate timeline, we glimpse what the world might have been, more whole, more gentle, less torn. And we mourn it. But that mourning is not wasted. It makes us softer. It helps us see others not as rivals or strangers, but as potential neighbors in a world that almost was. And maybe, could still be. Choosing the world we want. Here's the quiet truth behind this entire journey. Every day, we live at a crossroads. Every conflict avoided, every cruelty not chosen, every child taught with care instead of fear, bends the world slightly closer to peace. We don't need a new war to build a better world. We need imagination. We need memory. And we need rest. Because it's in rest, in stillness, in softness, that new ideas are born. This was not just a story. You've spent the last hour not just listening to an alternate history. You've been feeling it, breathing with it, letting your nervous system imagine something gentler. That's not fiction. That's healing. That's possibility. And even if we never live in the world we just described, we carry its lessons forward. In how we treat each other. In how we vote, build, teach, create. In how we speak softly when we could shout. In how we dream. And now, as your body folds into the deepest layers of sleep, remember, peace is not the absence of war. It's the presence of care. It's this moment, this breath, this possibility. In part 10, we will close our journey with one last lullaby, a gentle farewell to this imagined world, and a quiet return to our own. But for now, let it all go. You are safe. You are part of the peace. Still breathing? Let's stay here, for a moment longer. Half in the dream, half in the world you'll return to when morning comes. This second part of our reflection is about bridges. About how the imagined world without World War II connects to the one we know. Not in denial, but in dialogue. The gift of the impossible. What we imagined together was not a prediction. It wasn't even a plan. It was a kind of meditation. On hope. On slowness. On what it feels like to live in a world not constantly rebuilding, not constantly fearing collapse. A world where you're allowed to rest, to trust, to grow not because you had to, but because you could. And even if such a world never existed, the feeling it gave you, that's real. You can carry that. You can share it. Seeing the hidden roots of the present. When we peel away war from the 20th century, we reveal something else. How deeply shaped our world is by pain. How many of our institutions, alliances, values, even our inventions, emerged from trauma. Understanding that isn't about guilt. It's about clarity. It's about realizing that healing isn't just personal. It's planetary. That we don't just inherit the world's pain, we recreate it when we forget where it came from. But when we remember, we can soften the patterns. We can plant something gentler. Soft power, reimagined. In our imagined world, power wasn't about dominance. It was about presence. That's not a fantasy. That's an option. Right now, in our world, soft power is growing. The power of story, of design, of compassion, of listening. A country's strength is no longer just its weapons. It's how it treats its people. Its planet. Its history. We don't need a war to prove ourselves. We need each other. The practice of alternate history. Think of alternate history not as escapism, but as rehearsal. When we ask what if, we're rehearsing choices. We're training our imagination to look beyond fear, beyond inevitability, beyond despair. We're opening windows in walls. And sometimes, just by looking through those windows, we find new doors. You, as you might have been. Here's the most personal question of all. Who might you be in a world without World War II? Not just in some historical sense, but emotionally. Without inherited trauma. Without inherited silence. Without the echoes of loss passed down through culture, through parents, through systems. Would you be softer, freer, more curious? That person, you, still lives inside you. Not in spite of your pain, but alongside it. You don't have to become someone else. You just have to remember who you also are. The quiet revolution of rest. Finally, let's return to where we began. To rest. In this story, rest was not laziness. It was not a pause before war. It was the shape of peace. Let your body know that, now. Let your breath teach it. You are allowed to rest. Not because everything is perfect, but because your nervous system deserves peace, even in an imperfect world. Especially in one. So when you wake, don't rush to forget this place. Let it hum in the background. Let it change how you speak to others, how you forgive yourself, how you carry history. This dream wasn't an escape. It was a seed. In part 10, we'll offer a final goodbye, a gentle descent back into the waking world, and a quiet reminder that the dream doesn't end, it just changes shape. But for now, sleep. Let your imagined world wrap you like mist. You are home. You are held. Hello, dreamer. You've been with me through it all. Through a world that never knew firebombs or mushroom clouds. Through decades of peace that stretched like rivers, slow, steady, winding. You've seen cities that were never bombed, families that were never broken, art that grew not from agony, but from stillness. You've imagined what could have been, if war had never come. And now, we come home. Not with regret, but with reverence. Let's descend, gently. This was a story of sleep, but also of vision. What you heard tonight was not a bedtime story, though it may have helped you rest. It was a vision. A map drawn in the dark. A whisper from another timeline. A letter from a future that could still grow from the one we have. You don't need to believe in that world to be changed by it. You just need to remember how it made you feel. Safe, curious, capable of kindness. The power of letting go. Now, as you let your thoughts slow and your body soften into the last layers of sleep, think of everything you've carried. The stress, the headlines, the noise. They can rest now, too. Because your mind has walked a long way tonight. Not to escape, but to expand. You've made space for gentleness. You've proven that imagination is a form of resistance, and dreaming is a kind of choosing. And now, you get to choose peace. One breath at a time. The timeline you carry forward. You live in a world that did endure World War II. You carry that legacy, its horror, its inventions, its cautions, its growth. But alongside that, you now carry something else. A sense memory of what peace could have felt like, had we never known such fire. Let that shape your days. Let it soften your anger. Let it remind you that while we cannot rewrite the past, we are always writing the future. Even in sleep. A last blessing. As we close our eyes together one final time tonight, I offer you this. May you wake with gentleness. May you speak with more patience. May you remember that the world doesn't need to be perfect for you to rest in it. And may the quiet place we built together tonight, this world without war, remain inside you. Not as fantasy, but as possibility. You are part of that possibility. You always have been. Good night. And thank you for imagining with me.